The animal shelter was unusually quiet that Tuesday morning. Sarah, the head coordinator, walked through the rows of kennels with her clipboard, checking on each dog. She stopped at kennel number 17 and sighed deeply. Inside, a large German shepherd lay on a thin blanket, his body covered in scars and wounds that told a story of pain and neglect. The dog had been brought in 3 weeks ago by animal control officers, who found him lying in a ditch on the outskirts of town. His right hind leg was badly injured, possibly broken at some point and never properly treated. His ribs were visible through his matted fur, and there were multiple cuts across his face and body. The veterinarian estimated he was about 4 years old, but his eyes looked much older, filled with a sadness that broke the hearts of everyone who saw him. They named him Max, though no one knew his real name. When he first arrived, he couldn't even stand. The shelter staff worked tirelessly to nurse him back to some semblance of health. They fed him carefully, treated his wounds, and gave him pain medication. Slowly, Max began to improve. He could stand now, though he limped badly on that damaged leg. He could eat on his own, though he was still painfully thin. But there was something else wrong with Max, something deeper than his physical wounds. He never barked. He never wagged his tail. When people approached his kennel, he would simply lie there, watching them with those haunted eyes. He didn't growl or show aggression, but he didn't show affection either. It was as if the life had been drained out of him, leaving only an empty shell. Sarah had worked at the shelter for 12 years and had seen hundreds of dogs come through those doors. Some were happy and playful, quickly finding new homes. Others were scared or shy, needing time and patience. But Max was different. He seemed to have given up entirely, resigned to whatever fate awaited him. The shelter had a policy. They tried their best to find homes for every animal, but resources were limited. Space was limited. After a certain amount of time, if an animal wasn't adopted and if they were too sick or injured, or if their quality of life was too poor, difficult decisions had to be made. Max was approaching that deadline. Sarah had put Max's photo on the shelter's website and social media pages. She had written a heartfelt description, trying to convey his gentle nature despite his appearance. She had called local rescue groups and breed-specific organizations. She had even reached out to German Shepherd enthusiasts in the area. But week after week, no one came for Max. People would walk through the shelter looking at the dogs. They would coo over the puppies, laugh at the playful mutts, and consider the well-behaved adult dogs. Sometimes they would stop at Max's kennel. Sarah would see them pause, read his information card, and then she would watch their faces change. They would see his injuries, his limp, his scarred body. They would see the estimated veterinary costs listed on his card. They would see his blank, emotionless stare, and then they would move on. Some people asked about him. Sarah always answered honestly. Yes, his leg will probably always cause him problems. Yes, he'll need ongoing care. Yes, he's been through trauma and we don't know his full history. No, he doesn't show much personality right now. But that could change in the right home. But honesty, while important, didn't help Max find a family. Other shelter workers had grown attached to him despite his unresponsive nature. Jennifer, a young volunteer, would sit outside his kennel during her breaks talking to him softly. Marcus, the maintenance worker, always saved the best scraps from his lunch to give Max treats. Dr. Patterson, the vet who visited twice a week, had waived some of his fees for Max's treatment. They all hoped for a miracle. One Saturday afternoon, the shelter was hosting an adoption event. Local businesses had donated supplies for a raffle, a radio station was broadcasting live from the parking lot, and families were arriving in droves. Sarah watched with mixed emotions as several dogs found homes that day. It was wonderful to see them leave with happy families. But Max remained in his kennel, barely noticed by the crowds. As the event was winding down and the sun began to set, Sarah was helping clean up outside when she noticed a man standing near the entrance. He was different from the other visitors. While everyone else had been chatting and laughing, this man stood alone, completely still, watching the activity with an unreadable expression. He was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face. He wore simple clothes, clean but worn, a flannel shirt and jeans. What struck Sarah most was his silence. In all the hours of the event, amid the noise and excitement, this man hadn't said a word to anyone. He simply observed. As the last few families left and the volunteers began carrying supplies back inside, The man finally moved. He walked toward the shelter entrance with slow, deliberate steps. Sarah met him at the door. "Hello, can I help you?" she asked with her professional smile, tired but genuine. The man looked at her for a moment, then passed her into the shelter. He didn't speak. Sarah felt a slight unease but maintained her friendly demeanor. "Are you interested in adopting a pet? We had several dogs go home today, but we still have many wonderful animals available." The man gave a small nod. "Just one. Barely perceptible." "Would you like to come in and look around?" Sarah asked, holding the door open. Another nod. The man entered the shelter and Sarah followed, uncertain what to make of this silent visitor. She had dealt with all types of people over the years, some chatty, some reserved, some nervous. But this complete silence was unusual. The man walked slowly past the kennels. Unlike most visitors who stopped frequently, making comments about each dog, he moved steadily forward. His eyes scanned each kennel, but he didn't pause until he reached number 17. There, in front of Max's kennel, the silent man stopped. He stood perfectly still, looking at the injured German shepherd. Max, who typically remained lying down regardless of who passed by, did something unexpected. He lifted his head. Just slightly, but it was more reaction than he'd shown to any visitor in 3 weeks. The man and the dog looked at each other across the barrier of the kennel door. Neither moved. Neither made a sound. But something passed between them in that moment. Something Sarah couldn't quite understand but could definitely feel. It was as if two broken souls had recognized something in each other. Sarah approached quietly, not wanting to break whatever connection was forming. She stood beside the man and began her usual explanation. "This is Max. He came to us about 3 weeks ago in very bad shape. He's been recovering well physically, though his leg will probably always give him trouble. He's very quiet, hasn't shown much personality yet, but he's gentle and hasn't shown any aggression. He would need someone patient, someone willing to give him time to heal emotionally as well as physically." The man didn't acknowledge that he'd heard her. He simply continued to stare at Max. And Max continued to stare back, his head still raised, his eyes locked on this stranger. Sarah waited for the man to say something, to ask questions like everyone else did. How much would the adoption fee be? What kind of care would Max need? Did the shelter have any information about his past? But the silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Sarah tried again. "Would you like to meet him? We can take him to one of our meeting rooms. It's quieter there, less stressful for the dogs." The man turned to look at her for the first time since stopping at the kennel. His eyes were a deep brown, and there was something in them that reminded Sarah of Max's expression. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of deep weariness, as if he too had seen too much hardship. He nodded once more, then turned back to Max. Sarah felt a flutter of hope in her chest, something she hadn't felt regarding Max in days. She pulled out her key ring and unlocked the kennel door. "Let me get a leash on him. Max, come here, boy." Max didn't move at first. Then, with visible effort, he pushed himself up onto his feet. His injured leg shook slightly under his weight, but he stood. Sarah approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones as she clipped the leash to his collar. This was routine now, though Max never showed enthusiasm for walks like other dogs. But as Sarah led Max out of the kennel, something unusual happened. Max, who typically kept his head down during walks, stared at the silent man. His ears, which usually lay flat against his head, perked up just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was more life than Sarah had seen from him since his arrival. She led them both to the small meeting room at the end of the hallway. It was a simple space with a bench, some toys scattered in the corner, and a water bowl. The room was designed to be comfortable and quiet, a place where potential adopters could interact with animals without the stress of the busy kennel area. "You can sit on the bench if you'd like," Sarah said to the man. "I'll stay here initially, but I can give you some private time if you want. Max is very gentle, but because of his injuries, try not to make sudden movements. Let him come to you." The man walked to the bench and sat down slowly. He kept his hands on his knees and his body still. Sarah unclipped Max's leash, giving him freedom to move around the room or retreat to a corner if he wanted. For a long moment, nothing happened. Max stood where Sarah had left him and the man sat on the bench. Both were motionless and the room was completely silent except for the distant sounds of other dogs and shelter activity beyond the closed door. Then Max took a step forward. Just one, his limp pronounced as he shifted his weight. He stopped and looked at the man again. The man didn't move, didn't reach out, didn't speak. He simply waited. Max took another step, then another. It was slow, painful progress, but he was moving toward the man of his own accord. This was remarkable. Max had never willingly approached anyone before. When staff needed to handle him for medical care or cleaning, he tolerated it. But he'd never sought out human contact. Sarah held her breath, afraid that any sound or movement from her might break whatever spell was unfolding. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to be as invisible as possible. Max reached the bench. He stopped just in front of the man, close enough that the man could touch him if he reached out. But the man kept his hands on his knees. He looked down at Max, and Max looked up at him. The air in the room felt charged with something Sarah couldn't name. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute, the man slowly moved his right hand. He extended it, palm down, toward Max. Not touching him, just offering. Max looked at the hand, then back at the man's face. Then, in a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible, Max leaned forward and sniffed the man's hand. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. It was such a small thing, such a normal dog behavior, but for Max it was monumental. The man remained perfectly still as Max sniffed his hand, his wrist, his arm. Then Max pulled back slightly and sat down, wincing as his injured leg folded beneath him. The man's hand hovered in the air for a moment longer, then he gently lowered it to rest on top of Max's head. The touch was so light it barely disturbed Max's fur. Max didn't pull away. He didn't lean into the touch either, but he didn't pull away. They sat like that, man and dog, connected by that gentle touch for several minutes. Sarah watched, hardly daring to breathe. She had seen thousands of interactions between humans and animals in her years at the shelter. She had seen love at first sight between bouncing puppies and excited children. She had seen grateful senior dogs curl up beside kind retirees. But she had never seen anything quite like this. There was no excitement here, no tail wagging or happy barking. But there was something deeper, something profound. It was as if two beings who had both forgotten what connection felt like were carefully, tentatively remembering. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat softly. The man looked up at her, though his hand remained on Max's head. "I need to ask you some questions if you're interested in adopting Max," Sarah said gently. "It's part of our process. We need to make sure it's a good fit." The man looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since entering the shelter, he spoke. His voice was rough, as if from disuse, barely more than a whisper. "I want him." 3 words. That was all. But they were enough. Sarah pulled out her clipboard with the adoption application form. "Okay, that's wonderful. I'll need some information from you. Can I start with your name?" "Robert," the man said, his voice still quiet. "Robert Chen. Do you have a middle name, Robert?" "James." Sarah wrote it down, then proceeded through the form. Each answer was pulled from Robert like water from a deep well. He lived alone in a small house about 15 miles from town. He was retired military. He had no other pets. He had a fenced yard. He understood the medical needs and costs associated with Max's care. He could provide references. As Sarah asked questions and Robert answered in his sparse way, Max remained sitting beside the bench, his head now resting against Robert's leg. Robert's hand had moved from Max's head to his neck where it rested gently, barely touching. The application process usually took about 20 minutes, but with Robert's slow, careful responses, it stretched to nearly 40. Sarah didn't mind. She could see that each word was an effort for this man, and she respected that he was making that effort for Max. When they finished, Sarah reviewed the application. Everything was in order, though she would need to verify his references and do a home check, which was standard procedure for all adoptions. "Okay, Robert," she said. "Everything looks good here. I'll need to call your references and we'll need to schedule a home visit to make sure your space is appropriate for Max. This is just standard procedure we do for all our adoptions. It usually takes a few days to process everything. Would that be all right?" Robert looked down at Max and something that might have been worry crossed his face. "Can't take him today?" he asked. Sarah shook her head sympathetically. "I'm sorry, I know it's disappointing. But we have to follow our process. It's to protect both the animals and the adopters, to make sure every placement is successful. But if everything checks out with your references and home visit, which I'm sure it will, you can pick up Max probably by Wednesday or Thursday." Robert was quiet for a long moment. His hand tightened slightly on Max's neck, the first sign of strong emotion Sarah had seen from him. Robert finally nodded, accepting the situation, though clearly unhappy about it. He looked at Sarah with those tired eyes and asked, "Can I visit? Before Wednesday?" Sarah felt her heart warm toward this strange, silent man. "Of course you can. Visiting hours are from 10 in the morning until 6 in the evening every day. You're welcome to come spend time with Max whenever you'd like." Robert nodded again, then looked back down at Max. For several seconds, he just stared at the dog, as if memorizing every detail. Then, with visible reluctance, he stood up. Max's head lifted as he lost contact with Robert's leg, and for a brief moment something flickered in the dog's eyes. Not quite distress, but perhaps the closest thing to emotion anyone at the shelter had seen from him. Sarah clipped the leash back onto Max's collar. "I'll take him back to his kennel now. Thank you so much for choosing to adopt him, Robert. I really think you two will be good for each other." Robert didn't respond to that. He simply followed as Sarah led Max out of the meeting room and back down the hallway. When they reached Kennel 17, Max turned his head to look at Robert one more time before Sarah guided him inside. Robert stood there, watching through the chain link as Max slowly lowered himself back onto his blanket. "I'll be back tomorrow," Robert said, speaking to Max rather than to Sarah. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Sarah watched him go, then looked back at Max. The dog was staring at the empty hallway where Robert had disappeared. His head was up, his ears were forward, and there was something different about him. He looked more present, more aware than he had since arriving. "I think you might have found your person, Max," Sarah whispered. That evening, Sarah made the reference calls. Robert had listed his former commanding officer from the military, a neighbor, and someone from the VA hospital. Each person she spoke to said essentially the same thing. Robert Chen was a good man, quiet but reliable, who kept to himself but could be counted on when needed. He had served 2 tours overseas, had been honorably discharged, and now lived a simple, quiet life. All of them seemed surprised but pleased to hear he was adopting a dog. His neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Garcia, was particularly enthusiastic. "Oh, I'm so glad to hear this," she said over the phone. "Robert is such a kind soul, but he's been so alone since he came back. Never has visitors, rarely talks to anyone. A dog would be so good for him, and he'll take excellent care of it, I'm certain of that. His yard is secure and he maintains his property beautifully. If you need a good reference for him, you have it from me, absolutely." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the shelter early. She made her usual rounds, greeting the dogs and checking on their needs. When she reached Max's kennel, she found him in a position she'd never seen before. Instead of lying down in the back corner as he usually did, Max was sitting near the front of the kennel, facing the hallway, as if waiting for something. Or someone. At exactly 10 o'clock, the shelter doors opened and Robert walked in. He moved through the hallway with the same quiet purpose as before, not stopping until he reached Kennel 17. When Max saw him, the dog stood up. It was clearly painful, his leg trembling with the effort, but he stood and took 2 limping steps toward the kennel door. Sarah, who had been watching from her office, felt tears spring to her eyes again. In just one day, Max had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that most people would even notice, but Sarah noticed. The spark that had been completely extinguished in Max's eyes had been rekindled. Just barely, but it was there. She walked over to Robert, who was standing at the kennel door, his hand pressed flat against the chain link. Max had positioned himself on the other side as close as he could get, and was sniffing Robert's hand through the metal. "Good morning, Robert," Sarah said warmly. "I made the reference calls yesterday. Everyone spoke very highly of you. I just need to do the home visit, and then we can finalize the adoption. Would this afternoon work for you?" Robert looked at her and nodded. 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock is perfect. Would you like to spend some time with Max in the meeting room again? Robert nodded again, and Sarah unlocked the kennel. This time, when Max emerged, he didn't wait for direction. He limped directly to Robert and sat down beside him, leaning ever so slightly against his leg. Robert's hand immediately found its place on Max's head, resting there like it belonged. They spent 2 hours in the meeting room that morning. Sarah checked on them periodically, but mostly left them alone. Each time she peeked in, the scene was similar. Robert sat on the bench, Max sat or lay beside him, and Robert's hand maintained that gentle contact. Sometimes Robert spoke, his voice too quiet for Sarah to hear the words. Sometimes they just sat in silence. But there was a peacefulness in that room that had been absent when Max was alone in his kennel. At noon, Sarah reluctantly interrupted them. "Robert, I hate to break this up, but I need to get Max back to his kennel for his afternoon medication and feeding. You're welcome to come back after lunch if you'd like." Robert stood slowly, and Max stood with him. For a moment, man and dog looked at each other. Then Robert reached out and gently touched Max's scarred face, tracing one of the healed wounds with his finger. Max didn't flinch. He simply looked up at Robert with those dark eyes that had seen too much pain. "Soon," Robert said to Max. Just that one word, but it seemed to be a promise. That afternoon, Sarah drove to Robert's address. It was a modest house on a quiet street, older but well-maintained. The yard was neat, with a sturdy fence that would easily contain a large dog. Before she could even get out of her car, Robert emerged from the house. He showed her around without speaking much, letting the property speak for itself. The house was small but clean. There was a simplicity to it that matched Robert himself. No clutter, no excess, just the basics. The backyard was larger than it looked from the front, with a covered porch area and plenty of space for a dog to move around. The fence was secure, with no gaps or weak spots. Sarah could easily imagine Max here. She could picture him lying on that porch, could see him slowly exploring the yard at his own pace. This was a quiet place, a healing place perfect for a dog who needed time and patience to recover from his trauma. "This is perfect, Robert," Sarah said sincerely. "Max will be very happy here. Everything checks out. You can pick him up tomorrow morning if you'd like. We open at 10. For the first time, Sarah saw something that might have been a smile touch Robert's face. It was fleeting and small, but it was there. "Tomorrow," he repeated as if to himself. "I'll be there." That evening, Sarah stopped by Max's kennel before leaving for the day. "Tomorrow you're going home, Max," she told him. "You're going to have your own person, your own space. You're going to be safe and cared for." Max looked at her, and Sarah could swear there was understanding in his eyes. He knew something had changed. He knew that the silent man who had sat with him for hours today was going to come back. And somehow that knowledge had brought him back from wherever dark place he had retreated to in his mind. Robert Chen arrived at the shelter at 9:45 the next morning, 15 minutes before opening time. Sarah saw him through the window, standing by the door, absolutely still as always, simply waiting. She hurried to let him in early. "Good morning, Robert," she greeted him with a warm smile. "I have all the paperwork ready. Let me just go over a few things with you, and then Max is all yours." She led him to her office, where she had prepared a folder with Max's medical records, vaccination certificates, and care instructions. She went through each document carefully, explaining Max's medication schedule, his dietary needs, and recommendations for continued physical therapy for his leg. She provided the contact information for the vet clinic that worked with the shelter, and gave Robert a list of supplies he would need. Robert listened intently to every word, occasionally nodding to show he understood. When Sarah finished, she slid the adoption papers across her desk. "Just sign here, here, and here," she indicated the marked lines. "And then Max is officially yours." Robert picked up the pen with a hand that trembled slightly. He signed his name 3 times, each signature careful and deliberate. When he put the pen down, he looked at Sarah with an expression that conveyed more than his words ever had. "Thank you," his eyes seemed to say. "Thank you for trusting me with him." Sarah stood and extended her hand. Robert shook it, his grip firm despite his quiet nature. "Let's go get your dog," Sarah said. They walked together down the hallway to Kennel 17. Max was already standing at the door as if he had been waiting all morning. When he saw Robert, his tail moved. Just barely, just a tiny wag. But it was the first time anyone at the shelter had seen Max wag his tail. Sarah had to look away to hide the tears that threatened to spill. She opened the kennel door and clipped a leash to Max's collar. "This leash is a gift from the shelter," she said, handing it to Robert. "And we've put together a care package with some food, treats, and toys. Jennifer will bring it to your car." Robert took the leash, and the moment it was in his hand, Max moved to his side. The dog pressed against Robert's leg as close as he could get and looked up at his new owner with complete trust. They walked out of the shelter together, moving slowly to accommodate Max's limp. The other staff members had gathered near the entrance to say goodbye. Jennifer was crying openly. Marcus gave Robert a thumbs up and said, "You take good care of him, you hear?" Dr. Patterson, who had happened to be there for morning rounds, shook Robert's hand and said, "Call me if you have any concerns about his leg. Anytime, day or night." Robert nodded to each of them, acknowledging their care for Max. Then he led Max out the door and into the bright morning sunshine. Sarah followed them to Robert's truck, an older but well-maintained vehicle. Robert opened the passenger door and looked at Max, clearly wondering how to help the injured dog into the high cab. Before he could figure it out, Max gathered himself and jumped. It was painful to watch, his bad leg barely contributing to the effort, but pure determination got him into the seat. He immediately lay down, his head turning to look out the window at Robert as if afraid the man might leave without him. Robert closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. Sarah handed him the care package through the window after he started the engine. "You call us if you need anything," Sarah said. "Anything at all. And please come visit sometime. We'd love to see how he's doing." Robert looked at her, and this time the smile was unmistakable. "Thank you," he said, his quiet voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on him." Sarah watched them drive away, Max's head visible in the passenger window, and Robert's hand reaching over to rest on the dog's back. She stood in the parking lot long after the truck disappeared from view, feeling the strange mixture of sadness and joy that always came with successful adoptions. The drive to Robert's house took 20 minutes. Neither Robert nor Max made a sound during the journey. Robert drove carefully, aware of his precious cargo. Max lay still, but his eyes were alert, watching the world pass by the window. Every few minutes, Robert would glance over at him, still hardly believing that this damaged, beautiful creature was now his responsibility. When they arrived at the house, Robert parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he got out and opened the passenger door. Max looked down at the distance to the ground, clearly calculating whether he could manage the jump down. Robert didn't wait to find out. He reached in and carefully lifted Max in his arms. The dog was heavy, probably 60 pounds even in his underweight condition, and Robert wasn't a young man anymore. But he managed to lift Max and carry him to the front door, setting him down gently on the porch. Max stood there looking uncertain as Robert unlocked the door. "This is home," Robert said simply, pushing the door open. "You're home?" Max stepped inside cautiously, his nose working to take in all the new scents. Robert followed, watching as Max slowly explored the living room. The dog moved carefully, investigating each corner, each piece of furniture. He seemed particularly interested in a worn armchair near the window, sniffing it thoroughly. "That was my chair," Robert said, "but you can share it if you want." Max looked at him, then continued his exploration. He checked the kitchen, the hallway, and poked his nose into the bedroom. Through it all, Robert followed at a distance, letting Max investigate at his own pace. Finally, Max returned to the living room and, with visible effort, climbed onto the armchair. He circled once awkwardly with his bad leg, then lay down with a deep sigh. Robert walked over and sat on the floor beside the chair. He reached up and placed his hand on Max's head, resuming the gentle contact that had become their form of communication. They sat like that for a long time, man on the floor, dog in the chair, connected by touch and shared silence. Over the next few days, Robert and Max began to develop a routine. Robert would wake at 6, a habit from his military days that he'd never broken. He would take Max outside to the backyard, moving slowly so Max could manage with his injured leg. Then Robert would prepare breakfast for both of them, Max's special food mixed with his medication and simple eggs and toast for himself. After breakfast, they would sit together, sometimes on the porch if the weather was nice, sometimes in the living room if it wasn't. Robert would read the newspaper while Max lay beside him or at his feet. Robert found that he started reading out loud, his quiet voice breaking the silence of the house that had been so complete for so many years. Max would listen, his ears perking up at the sound of Robert's voice. In the afternoons, Robert would work on gentle physical therapy exercises with Max, following the instructions the shelter had provided. He would massage Max's injured leg, help him do slow stretches, encourage him to walk a little farther each day. Max tolerated these sessions with patience, seeming to understand that Robert was trying to help him. Mrs. Garcia, the neighbor, came over on the third day with a casserole and a bag of dog toys. "Welcome home, Max," she said warmly, bending down with some difficulty to pet the dog. Max sniffed her hand and allowed the touch, though he stayed close to Robert's side. He's perfect for you, Robert, Mrs. Garcia said, straightening up. I can already see a difference in you. Robert didn't ask what she meant. He knew what she meant. For the first time in years, he had a reason to wake up in the morning beyond simple existence. He had someone depending on him, someone who needed him. And somehow, through caring for Max's wounds, Robert found that his own invisible wounds hurt a little less. 2 weeks into their new life together, something unexpected happened. Robert woke up in the middle of the night, pulled from sleep by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. He lay in the darkness listening. Then he heard it again, a whimper, soft and frightened, coming from the living room where Max slept in his bed near the armchair. Robert got up quickly and walked to the living room. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, he could see Max lying in his bed, but the dog's body was trembling. His legs were moving as if he was running, and small sounds of distress came from his throat. A nightmare. Robert knew about nightmares. He'd had his share of them over the years. Dreams that pulled him back to places he'd rather forget. He knelt down beside Max's bed and placed his hand gently on the dog's side. It's okay, Max, he said softly. You're safe. You're home. It's okay. Max's eyes opened suddenly, wild and unfocused. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize where he was. His body tensed, preparing to bolt despite his injured leg. But then his eyes found Robert's face, and slowly the panic receded. Max's breathing gradually steadied and his trembling decreased. Robert sat down on the floor, his back against the armchair, and kept his hand on Max. I know, he said quietly. I know about the bad dreams. They come for me too sometimes, but we're here now and we're safe, both of us. Max lifted his head and rested it on Robert's leg. They stayed like that for the rest of the night, Robert sitting on the floor, Max's head in his lap. Robert talked quietly, not about anything in particular, just letting the sound of his voice fill the silence and chase away whatever demons had been haunting Max's sleep. When morning came, Robert's back ached from sitting on the floor all night, but he didn't care. Max had needed him and he had been there. That was what mattered. From that night on, their bond deepened. Max began to follow Robert from room to room, his limp still pronounced but improving slightly with the daily exercises. When Robert sat, Max would lie down nearby, always keeping Robert in his line of sight. When Robert spoke, Max's ears would perk up, and his eyes would focus intently on Robert's face. More remarkably, Max began to change in other ways. His tail started wagging more frequently, not just the small movement from that first day, but real wags that increased in enthusiasm each day. He started to show interest in the toys Mrs. Garcia had brought, picking them up cautiously at first, then carrying them around the house as if claiming them as his own. He even attempted to play once, dropping a rubber ball near Robert's feet and looking up expectantly. Robert had picked up the ball, studying it as if it were some foreign object. He hadn't played with a dog since he was a child, decades ago, before the military, before the deployment, before everything changed. But Max was looking at him with such hope in those dark eyes that Robert couldn't refuse. He tossed the ball gently across the room. Max watched it bounce and roll, then looked back at Robert as if asking permission. Robert nodded and Max limped after it, moving faster than Robert had seen him move before. The dog picked up the ball and brought it back, dropping it at Robert's feet. His tail wagged so hard his whole back end moved with it. They played like that for 10 minutes, Robert throwing, Max retrieving despite his injury. It was simple and slow, but it was play, and it was the first time Robert had felt something close to joy in years. When Max finally tired and lay down at Robert's feet, panting but content, Robert sat beside him and ran his hand along the dog's scarred back. You're healing, Robert said softly, on the outside and the inside. Me too, I think. We're both healing. A month after Max came home, Robert decided it was time to take him back to the shelter for a visit. Sarah had called several times to check on them, and Robert could hear the genuine care in her voice each time. She deserved to see how far Max had come. When they walked through the shelter doors, Jennifer was at the front desk. Her eyes went wide when she saw them. Max? Oh my goodness, Max. She came around the desk quickly, then stopped, remembering how unresponsive Max had been before. Can I pet him? Robert nodded and Jennifer knelt down slowly. Max sniffed her hand, then his tail began to wag. He even leaned into her touch as she petted his head. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. I can't believe this is the same dog, she whispered. He's actually happy. Sarah emerged from her office, drawn by Jennifer's excited voice. When she saw Robert and Max, her hand went to her mouth. She walked over slowly, taking in every detail of Max's transformation. He had gained weight, his coat was shinier and well-groomed, and his eyes were bright and alert. But more than the physical changes, there was an energy about him that hadn't been there before. He looked like a dog who knew he was loved. "Robert," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is incredible. How is he doing, really?" Robert, in his typical sparse way, said simply, "Good, we're both good." But Sarah could see it was more than good. She could see the bond between them, visible in how Max stayed close to Robert, how his eyes constantly checked to make sure Robert was nearby, how Robert's hand rested naturally on Max's head. They had saved each other. Marcus came out from the back carrying a bag of dog food. When he saw Max, he set the bag down with a thump and grinned widely. "Well, look at you. That's what I'm talking about." "I knew you had it in you, buddy." Dr. Patterson was called, and he came out to examine Max's leg. He had Max walk back and forth, checked his range of motion, and felt along the old injury carefully. Max tolerated the examination calmly, occasionally glancing at Robert for reassurance. "The improvement is remarkable," Dr. Patterson said to Robert. "The physical therapy you've been doing is really helping. He'll always have some limitations with that leg, but he's managing better than I expected. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." They spent an hour at the shelter with staff members coming by to see Max and comment on his transformation. Each person who had known Max in his darkest days was moved by seeing him now. But eventually, Robert could see that Max was getting tired from all the attention and stimulation. "We should go," Robert said to Sarah. Sarah walked them to the door. Before they left, she touched Robert's arm gently. "Thank you for sending me photos and updates. It means the world to us to see him doing so well. You've given him a second chance at life." Robert looked down at Max, then back at Sarah. "He gave me one too," he said quietly. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her, and Sarah understood the weight of those words. As they drove home, Robert thought about what Sarah had said. A second chance. That's what this was for both of them. Max had been given up on, left to suffer, betrayed by whatever humans had hurt him so badly. Robert had withdrawn from the world, isolated himself, lived but not really been alive. They had both been broken, both been lost. But now, sitting beside him in the truck, Max looked out the window with interest at the passing scenery. His tail gave a small wag when Robert's hand reached over to rest on his back. They were finding their way back to life together, one slow step at a time. That evening, Robert sat on his porch with Max lying beside him, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Mrs. Garcia waved from her yard, and Robert waved back, something he never would have done a few months ago. A neighbor walking by stopped to admire Max and ask about him, and Robert found himself actually engaging in a brief conversation, telling the neighbor Max's story. After the neighbor moved on, Robert looked down at Max. The dog was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and Robert could swear he saw understanding there. Max knew what Robert had been through, just as Robert knew what Max had endured. They didn't need words to communicate that understanding. It was simply there, a silent acknowledgement between two souls who had survived their own battles. "Tomorrow we'll walk a little farther," Robert said to Max. "Maybe down to the park. Would you like that?" Max's tail thumped against the porch boards twice. Robert smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. 6 weeks ago, the idea of smiling, of planning tomorrow, of feeling anything beyond numbness would have seemed impossible. But Max had changed everything. 3 months into their journey together, autumn arrived with cooler temperatures and falling leaves. Robert discovered that Max loved the autumn weather. The dog would stand in the backyard, nose lifted to catch the crisp air, his tail wagging as leaves swirled around him. On their daily walks, which had gradually extended from just around the block to nearly a mile, Max would sometimes try to catch falling leaves, his playful side emerging more each day despite his permanent limp. One morning, Robert received a phone call from the VA hospital. His counselor, a woman named Dr. Martinez, whom he'd been seeing irregularly for the past 2 years, wanted to schedule an appointment. Robert usually dreaded these calls, often canceling or simply not showing up. But this time something was different. "I can come in," Robert said, Wednesday at 2? Dr. Martinez sounded surprised but pleased. Wednesday at 2 works perfectly, Robert. I'll see you then. When Wednesday came, Robert hesitated at the door. He'd never brought Max anywhere except the shelter and on their walks. But the thought of leaving Max home alone for 2 hours bothered him more than he expected. He looked down at the dog, who was watching him with his head tilted questioningly. Want to come with me? Robert asked. Max's tail wagged enthusiastically, and Robert made a decision. He clipped on Max's leash and they drove to the VA hospital together. When he walked into the waiting room with Max at his side, the receptionist looked uncertain. Sir, I'm not sure if dogs are allowed. He's my service dog, Robert said. It wasn't exactly true, at least not officially, but it wasn't exactly false either. Max had been serving Robert in ways no one else could understand. The receptionist looked at Max, who was sitting calmly beside Robert, and nodded. Of course, Dr. Martinez will be with you shortly. When Dr. Martinez called Robert back, her eyes widened at the sight of Max. Robert, you didn't mention you had a dog. Got him a few months ago, Robert said simply. They settled into Dr. Martinez's office, Max lying down at Robert's feet. The counselor spent the first few minutes of the session simply observing the interaction between man and dog, noting how Robert's hand would occasionally reach down to touch Max's head, how Max would lean against Robert's leg, how there was a calmness to Robert that she hadn't seen in the 2 years she'd been working with him. Tell me about him, Dr. Martinez said, setting aside her usual list of questions, and Robert talked. Not in his usual sparse sentences, but in actual paragraphs. He told her about finding Max at the shelter, about the dog's injuries and trauma, about their first meeting and the silent understanding that had passed between them. He talked about the nightmares Max had, about the slow process of healing for both of them, about how caring for Max had given him a purpose he hadn't realized he needed. Dr. Martinez listened, occasionally asking questions but mostly just letting Robert speak. It was the most she'd ever heard him say in a single session. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. Robert, you've made more progress in 3 months with Max than in 2 years of our sessions. Not that our work together hasn't been valuable, but there's something about the bond you formed with him that's reaching places I couldn't. Robert looked down at Max. He understands. He's been there. Not the same place, but close enough. We don't have to explain ourselves to each other. That's profound, Dr. Martinez said. And it's exactly what trauma recovery can look like. Sometimes healing comes from unexpected places. Have you thought about getting Max certified as an actual service dog? There are programs specifically for veterans. It might open up more opportunities for you to bring him places, and it would formalize the role he's already playing in your life. Robert hadn't thought about it, but the idea made sense. He nodded slowly. Tell me more. By the time Robert left the VA hospital an hour later, he had information packets about service dog certification programs and a renewed sense of purpose. Max had not only given him companionship but had opened doors Robert thought were permanently closed. Over the following weeks, Robert began the process of getting Max certified. It required training sessions, evaluations, and documentation of Max's temperament and abilities. Despite his physical limitations, Max proved to be remarkably intelligent and responsive. He learned commands quickly, could sense when Robert was becoming anxious or withdrawn, and knew how to provide the grounding presence Robert needed. The trainer they worked with, a woman named Lisa who specialized in service dogs for veterans, was impressed by the bond between them. Usually we train the dogs first and then match them with veterans, she explained during one of their sessions. But you two have something special that developed naturally. My job is just to formalize it and teach Max some additional skills that will help him help you better. Max learned to recognize the signs of Robert's anxiety attacks before they fully developed. He would press against Robert's leg, providing physical contact that helped ground him. He learned to create space between Robert and other people when Robert became overwhelmed in public. He learned to wake Robert from nightmares with a gentle paw on his arm instead of a startling bark. But the most remarkable thing was how Max's own healing accelerated through this process. Having a job, a purpose, seemed to complete something in Max just as it completed something in Robert. The dog who had been too traumatized to show any emotion now worked with confidence and clear pride in his abilities. 4 months into their training, Max passed his certification evaluation with flying colors. The evaluator noted in her report that despite his physical injury, Max demonstrated exceptional emotional intelligence and an extraordinary bond with his handler. Robert received the official service dog vest and certification papers on a crisp November afternoon. That evening, Robert carefully put the vest on Max for the first time. The vest was dark blue with patches identifying Max as a service dog. Max sat patiently as Robert adjusted the straps, then stood and looked at himself in the mirror, as if understanding the significance of what he was wearing. "You're official now," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're my partner, my helper, my friend." Max's tail wagged and he pressed his head against Robert's hand. Robert knelt down, something his aging knees protested but his heart demanded, and wrapped his arms around Max. The dog who had been beaten and abandoned, who had given up on humans and life itself, leaned into the embrace of the man who had also lost his way. They stayed like that for a long moment, two broken souls who had found each other and, in finding each other, had found themselves again. The next day, Robert decided to do something he hadn't done in over 3 years. He went to the grocery store during the busy afternoon hours. Before Max, he had only shopped early in the morning when the store was nearly empty, unable to handle the crowds and noise. But with Max by his side, wearing his service vest, Robert felt a confidence he couldn't quite explain. They walked through the automatic doors together. The usual sounds that would have sent Robert's anxiety spiraling washed over him. But Max pressed against his leg and Robert focused on that pressure, that solid presence. They moved through the aisles slowly, Robert picking up items while Max walked calmly beside him, occasionally looking up to check on Robert's state of mind. A few people stared. Some smiled. One child asked if they could pet the working doggy, and Robert, instead of freezing or fleeing, actually stopped and explained gently why service dogs shouldn't be petted while working. The child's mother thanked him and praised Max's good behavior. Robert felt a swell of pride, both in Max and in himself, for handling the interaction. At the checkout, the cashier commented on what a beautiful dog Max was. Robert found himself sharing a bit of their story, how Max had been rescued from the shelter, how they were helping each other heal. The cashier's eyes misted over and she said, "That's the most beautiful thing I've heard all day. You're both very lucky to have found each other." Walking back to the truck with bags of groceries and Max beside him, Robert realized something profound. He hadn't just survived that shopping trip. He had actually felt comfortable, almost normal. The panic that used to rise in his chest in crowded places had been held at bay by Max's presence. The isolation he had wrapped around himself like armor had cracked open, letting in light and human connection. 6 months after Robert first walked into that shelter and met a broken German Shepherd in Kennel 17, Sarah received an envelope in the mail at work. Inside was a photograph and a handwritten letter. The photograph showed Robert and Max sitting on a porch, both looking at the camera. Robert was actually smiling, a real genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. Max sat beside him, tongue out in a happy pant, his service vest visible, his eyes bright and alert. They looked like they belonged together, like two puzzle pieces that had finally found their match. Sarah unfolded the letter, recognizing Robert's careful handwriting. "Dear Sarah and everyone at the shelter," it began. "I'm not good with words, never have been. But I wanted you to know what Max has meant to me. You saw him at his worst. Injured, scared, given up on life. You saw me too, though maybe you didn't realize it. I was also injured, also scared, also given up on life in my own way. When I walked into that shelter 6 months ago, I wasn't looking for a dog. I had been driving around town, no real destination, just trying to fill another empty day. I saw your adoption event sign and something made me stop. I told myself I was just looking, just passing time. But the truth is, I think some part of me was looking for a reason to keep going. I walked past all those dogs, all those animals looking for homes. They were barking and playing, full of life. I felt nothing. Then I saw Max. He was the only one not making noise, not trying to get attention. He just lay there, looking like he had accepted that this was all life had left to offer him. I saw myself in him. I didn't decide to adopt him that first day. The decision came later, but looking back, I think Max decided for me. When he lifted his head and looked at me, something passed between us. Recognition, maybe, or just two damaged beings seeing themselves reflected in each other. These past 6 months have changed everything. Max needed me to feed him, to give him medicine, to help him exercise his bad leg. Simple things, but they gave me a routine, a purpose. I couldn't stay in bed all day because Max needed to go outside. I couldn't skip meals because Max needed to eat at regular times. I couldn't hide from the world because Max needed walks and fresh air. But Max gave me more than just routine. He gave me understanding without judgment. When I wake up at 3 in the morning from nightmares, he's there, pressing his head against me, reminding me where I am, that I'm safe. When I start to panic in crowds, he leans against me, and that weight, that solid presence brings me back. When I go days without talking because the words won't come, he doesn't mind. He communicates without words, too. We understand each other. People talk about humans rescuing dogs, and that's how it looks from the outside. I adopted Max from your shelter. I gave him a home, medical care, food, and safety. But the truth is more complicated. Max rescued me just as much as I rescued him, maybe more. I've started going to my counseling sessions regularly now. I go to the store without feeling like the walls are closing in. I talk to my neighbors. I even went to a veteran support group meeting last week, something I'd been avoiding for years. Max came with me, and his presence made it possible for me to walk through that door. Max's leg will never be perfect. He'll always limp, always have some pain on bad days. I'll probably always have nightmares, always struggle with crowds and loud noises. We're both permanently marked by what happened to us, but we're not broken anymore. Or maybe we are still broken, but we're broken together, and somehow that makes us whole. I wanted you to know this because you didn't give up on Max when everyone else did. You kept him safe, kept him comfortable, waited for the right person to see what you saw in him. You trusted me with him even though I was a stranger who barely spoke. You took a chance on both of us. Max is now a certified service dog. He goes everywhere with me. People see his vest and they see a dog helping a veteran. What they don't see is how much that veteran needed saving, how close he was to giving up entirely. They don't know that the dog wearing that vest was once considered unadoptable, too damaged to be wanted. I think about that sometimes, about how easily our story could have gone differently. If I had driven past your shelter that day, if Max had been put down before I met him, if you had decided he was too injured, too expensive, too much trouble to save, but none of those things happened. Instead, two souls who had given up on connection found each other. Thank you for saving Max so he could save me. Thank you for trusting me when I couldn't explain with words why I needed him. Thank you for believing that damaged things can heal, and that healing is worth the effort and the cost and the patience required. Max is sleeping next to me as I write this, his head resting on my foot. In a few minutes, we'll go for our evening walk. We'll probably go to the park where we go every evening now. There's a bench there under an oak tree where we sit and watch the sunset. Max likes to watch the birds, and I like to just sit in the peace of the moment, something I couldn't do before him. This letter is getting long, and I'm not used to writing so much. But I wanted you to understand what you gave us both. You gave us a second chance. You gave us hope when hope seemed foolish. You gave us each other. If you're ever working with another dog like Max, another one that seems too broken to save, please don't give up. Somewhere out there is another person like me, another broken human who needs exactly that dog. They'll find each other if you just hold on long enough. With gratitude, Robert and Max Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She showed it to Jennifer, to Marcus, to Dr. Patterson, to everyone who had known Max in those dark weeks. They passed it around, each person reading it with wet eyes and full hearts. Jennifer photocopied it and posted it on the bulletin board in the break room, where it would remain for years to come, a reminder of why they did this work. On the hardest days, when they had to make difficult decisions or when they felt overwhelmed by the never-ending stream of animals needing help, they would read Robert's letter and remember that every animal saved was a potential miracle waiting to happen. Sarah kept the original letter and the photograph in her desk drawer. Sometimes, when she felt discouraged, she would take them out and look at them. The transformation in Max was visible in the photo, but more remarkable was the transformation in Robert. The man who had walked into her shelter 6 months ago, silent and hollow, had found his voice and his purpose through loving a dog that no one else wanted. That evening, as Sarah was locking up the shelter, she stopped at the kennels to say goodnight to the dogs. One kennel held a new arrival, an elderly beagle with failing eyesight and arthritic legs. Another held a pit bull mix who had been surrendered because he had too much energy for his previous family. Yet another held a 3-legged cat who had been born that way and was now 6 years old, passed over again and again for younger, normal pets. Sarah looked at each of them and thought about Max and Robert. Somewhere out there were the perfect matches for these animals. People who would see past the age, the imperfections, the challenges. People who needed exactly what these animals had to offer. Her job was to keep them safe and comfortable until those people found them. "Your person is out there," she whispered to the old beagle. "They're coming. We just have to wait." Meanwhile, across town, Robert and Max were indeed sitting on their favorite bench in the park under the oak tree. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Max's head rested on Robert's lap, and Robert's hand moved slowly through the dog's fur, following the pattern of scars that told Max's story of survival. A young couple walked past, pushing a stroller. They smiled at Robert and Max. "Beautiful dog," the man said. "Thank you," Robert replied. "He's pretty special." After they passed, Robert looked down at Max. "You know what? I'm pretty lucky. The luckiest man in the world, actually, because I found you, or you found me. However it happened." Max's tail thumped against the bench and he let out a small sound, almost like a sigh of contentment. It was the kind of sound that spoke of peace, of belonging, of home. They sat there until the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Then Robert stood slowly, his knees creaking, and Max stood too, shaking himself and stretching as much as his bad leg allowed. They walked back to the truck together, their steps synchronized after months of moving through life as a team. The drive home was quiet, as most of their time together was, but it was a comfortable silence now, filled with understanding and companionship, rather than loneliness and pain. When they got home, Robert prepared dinner for both of them and they ate together in the kitchen, Max from his bowl on the floor, Robert at the small table. After dinner, they settled into their evening routine. Robert in his armchair with a book, Max sprawled beside the chair close enough to touch. Every few minutes, Robert's hand would reach down to rest on Max's back, reassuring himself that the dog was still there, that this wasn't a dream, that he truly wasn't alone anymore. Before bed, they went out one last time to the backyard. The night was clear and cool, and Max sniffed around the yard while Robert stood on the porch looking up at the stars. He thought about where he'd been 6 months ago, about the darkness that had seemed endless. He thought about the day he'd walked into that shelter with no plan, no hope, just empty time to fill.